Welcome back, everyone. It's Mr. Alviar for another chapter of Cabin on Trouble Creek by Gene Benlin. We're in the month of April now. Can you believe it? The boys have been there in the middle of this new state of Ohio, in this vast, vast, unending forest since August. Wow, it's April. They've made it through the winter months. And Solomon's here. Chapter 20. Solomon left 2 days later. He said goodbye to the boys standing outside the cabin. "I go back to my people," he said. "Cannot stay in place that makes my heart sad." Daniel felt his own heart sink. He had just started not feeling alone, and now Solomon was leaving them again. Will's face looked long, too. Just a moment ago he had been jubilant, showing Solomon how he'd attached his spear point to the heavy shaft with tight strips of deer hide. The Indian seemed to sense their feelings. "Boys have good house," he told them encouragingly. "Catch many chimamoose, many fish. The time of planting comes soon. You chop trees, put seed in the ground, raise plenty of corn." Daniel nodded. Now that the hard winter was past, they would be all right, he was pretty sure. It was just that they'd be alone again. "Will you come back?" Will asked, his voice sounding almost pleading. Solomon hesitated a moment. "Maybe at the time of hunting," he said. But then he stopped and added, "Maybe Solomon's bones are too old." Daniel thought of Grandpap and how he talked about his poor old bones aching in the cold and damp. And he thought of how how far he had to walk. He had no idea how many miles, but surely his journey was many days. Maybe he wouldn't come back. And suddenly, he wanted to give Solomon something. "Wait," he said, darting inside the cabin. His eyes ranged around the small room, seeing the 2 cooking pots, the meal sack, the blankets, the bowl filled with fish hooks, another bowl with deer hide strips. What did he have to give anyone, he wondered. The cup that he had carved sat on the rough table. It wasn't much, but it was all Daniel could think of. He picked it up and hurried outside. "Take this," he said, holding it out to Solomon. He felt a bit foolish. A poorly carved cup was so little to give after all. "We thank you for everything," Daniel said, with a wave of his hand, awkwardly. Solomon took the cup, turning it over slowly to look at each side. "Boy made this. Good," he said. And once more Daniel felt a little flush of pride. And then, without another word, Solomon walked away. As he was about to disappear among the dark tree, Will called out. "Goodbye," he said. Solomon turned. He waved briefly, and then he was gone. All the rest of the day, Daniel felt something heavy weighing him down, sinking his spirits. It wasn't just Solomon's leaving. He had known that that would come, though he hoped not so soon. It was something else. But it wasn't until that night, as he lay wrapped in his blanket staring into the flickering fire, that he figured out what it was. Not once since the first day had Solomon said a word about Pa and Ma this time. It was as if he knew that Pa and Ma were never coming. Was that what Solomon thought? He had spoken as if Daniel and Will were going to be chopping down trees and planting corn all by themselves. And was that what he, Daniel, thought? He didn't really know what he thought. All winter he had pushed the family out of his mind, just dealing with what he and Will had to do to survive. He had known deep down that Pa wouldn't be traveling in such harsh winter. But now spring was coming on. Mightn't they be setting out now? Whatever had gone wrong last fall should be fixed by now, unless, of course, what had happened was so terrible that he would never see any of them again. Daniel was afraid to get his hopes up, only to see them dashed again. The thing to do, he decided, was not to count days or keep watching for Pa and Ma, not even to talk to Will about it. The two of them needed to do exactly what Solomon had said: chop down trees and make a field for planting corn. That was what Pa had planned to do come spring. He had talked about it so many times. Of course, Pa had other plans too, grander ones, like planting a field of wheat as well, and buying a cow and maybe some pigs. Pigs could live in the forest, foraging for themselves all summer, and then you'd have them to slaughter for their meat in the fall. One thing at a time, Daniel told himself, his eyelids drooping at last. First, the trees. Chopping down the trees to make a field was not going to be an easy task. With the axe in his hand, Daniel looked around him the next morning. Why, some of those trunks were so wide around, so massive and hard-skinned that he and Will hadn't a chance of cutting them down. With their gnarly branches, their odd-shaped knobs that looked like bony knees, they reminded him of the granddaddies they were. The axe would bounce right off those tough old hides. Even the smaller ones, those that he could reach around, would be days of work. They had only one axe after all, and he and Will were nowhere near as handy with it as Pa. Many a day that he'd watched Pa cutting down trees for the cabin, Daniel knew well enough how it was done, and he had cut down saplings and chopped firewood for hours on end. But he had yet to bring down a full-sized tree all by himself. "We should start right here," he told Will. They stood by the south side of the cabin, near the spot where they'd found the deer killed by the wolves. At home, fields were some distance away from the house, but here they'd have to plant close by. That way they could use the start of the clearing that Pa had already made. And on this side of the cabin, Daniel calculated, there were fewer giant trees. He picked out a tree to start with. Not a really big one, but a fair-sized one. A young elm, he thought it was. Daniel pictured Pa in his mind. The first thing that Pa would do was cut a notch in the side of the tree, the side that he wanted it to fall. No question, this was going to be away from the cabin. And with a few half swings, he made his notch. Now he could just swing away. "Stand clear," he told Will. Daniel brought back the axe. He coiled himself up like he'd seen Pa do, and then he swung from his heels. But somehow his curled strength didn't travel straight up to his hands the way that Pa's strength did. The axe head was heavy. It threw him off balance, and he came close to falling over. Looking up, he saw that the axe had barely bitten into the tree. Daniel felt silly. He looked over to see if Will was laughing at him, and thankfully, Will wasn't. "Guess I ought to slow down," he muttered. His next swing wasn't so hard. Daniel saw a small chip fall to the ground. He kept swinging, and pretty soon he began to feel a rhythm to it. Stand back, look at the tree, take aim, swing. Stand back, take aim, swing. Chips started flying. Slowly, the cut in the tree became deeper. After a while, though, Daniel's arms began to ache. His back and shoulders were sore. His swings slowed down, and he could see that the axe head wasn't biting in as far. Finally, he had to stop and rest. He leaned on the axe handle and wiped his damp forehead with his shirt tail. Looking sideways at the cut that he'd made, he could see it wasn't as deep as he'd thought it was, not near deep enough to fell that tree. "My turn," said Will eagerly. He had trouble, too, to start, but he kept at it like Will always did, slowly deepening the wound in the elm's side while Daniel leaned his back against a nearby tree to rest. And then when Will started slowing down, Daniel took up the axe again. They went on like that all morning, taking turns, chopping and resting, and it seemed to Daniel that they'd never get through that tree trunk. If it was Pa swinging the axe, he'd likely have 2 or 3 down by now. They stopped for a drink of water and slabs of johnny cake. Daniel was feeling so puny he needed something to build back his strength. Though they were both too tired to talk, Will's face told him that he felt the same way. The food and short rest helped, and in a few minutes Will was back up and reaching for the axe. "Are you ready?" he said. He took his turn chopping, and then Daniel did again, thinking about how long these trees had stood on his spot, or this spot, without anyone bothering them. Rooted side by side, standing shoulder to shoulder, their branches interlacing in a friendly sort of way. It was no wonder these trees weren't going down, Daniel wondered. But he could be stubborn too, he thought. They were going to go down. They just had to let the sun in, to warm the earth, to make a place to plant, so that he and Will, the intruders, could live here too. Starting with this tree. Daniel swung the axe with new energy. He was starting to get the hang of it now, he thought, planting himself firm, gathering all the power he possessed from his feet and sending it upward to his arms, then out through the sharp head of the axe, like Pa, maybe. He didn't feel tired anymore either, just determined to conquer this enemy. He swung and saw the gash grow deeper and wider, and swung some more, and finally he sliced into the heart of the tree, and it swayed. Daniel looked around to see where Will was standing. "Stay back!" he warned, and he swung again. But that tree stayed upright. He swung once more, and the elm leaned slowly toward the giant next to it, brushing the broad trunk with its branches like it was saying goodbye as it fell. "We did it!" Will shouted. "Woo-hoo!" And he climbed up on the fallen trunk, waving his arms triumphantly. Daniel set down the axe. Now that it was done, it seemed like all the strength had finally drained right out of him. He was so tired that he could barely stand. He looked at that tree that he and Will had brought down. It didn't seem like the enemy now. It sprawled, broken on the ground, its trunk appearing somehow small. Its top branches still upright, leaning against its neighbor's trunk. On the tips of the branches, the new leaves were just unfolding. Daniel felt a fleeting sadness for those leaves that would never grow out, for taking their life. But it had to be done, he thought. "Well, that's the first one," he said, picking up the axe again. And we'll stop right there. Thank you for joining me for another chapter of Cabin on Trouble Creek. Tomorrow, I'll read chapter 21. All right, go and brush those teeth. Wash those dirty hands and that dirty face of yours. I see you've got some ice cream on your upper lip. Come on, you can't fool me. Or maybe that's, let me see, candy. You've been eating suckers, haven't you? All right, now brush your teeth twice. Wash those hands, wash that face. Get into those pajamas, tell your family you love them, and have a good night's sleep. Adios, my friends.